California has always been thirsty for water. There simply isn't enough to go around. Northern California has it, the South and the Central Valley need it, and the fish and wildlife depend on it. 3 years of drought in California has been costing California dearly. Richard Howard, an agricultural resource economist, says water restrictions could mean up to $800 million in lost income and force 25,000 people out of work in the San Joaquin and Tulare valleys this year.
It's devastating for the labor market in the valley. This is a labor market that doesn't have much leeway because they've been hit with the construction slowdown for other sorts of manual laboring jobs, and they're really reliant on these farm jobs, particularly in these small communities.
Despite spring rains, California remains mired in a serious drought.
And over the last 3 years, our runoff has been very much below normal. And the runoff is sort of the best indicator of where we're at in terms of a drought. It's not just the rain and snow, but over a whole year, how much do you actually get in those river basins? And 2 years ago, the water year had 53% of normal. Last year, 58% of normal runoff. And our projection for this year is only 70% of normal. So we're not working our way out of that hole.
As the senior meteorologist for the state, Lund says no one can directly link this current drought to global climate change, but it may be a sign of things to come.
We'll look at the 10 to 20 to 30-year period and see if in that amount of time we were in drought more often than some other previous 10, 20, or 30-year period. But one of the things that the computer models do agree on across the world globally is that the southwestern part of the United States is very likely to get drier.
Meanwhile, geologists at UC Davis are finding clues to climate change deep beneath the Sierra.
In the past decade is really when we started moving from a shift from what was really a marine-dominated perspective to starting to look at terrestrial records. And caves, stalagmites in particular, are probably the most faithful and most continuous records.
Graduate student Jessica Oster is looking at the mineral traces left by thousands of years of water dripping in these caves. Stalagmites grow from the groundwater that trickles into the cave over millenniums.
If what we observe in the past is going to hold true for today, then as the climate warms, we could expect to see it get drier here.
These cave deposits are like climate clocks.
Stalagmites are particularly useful because we can date them very accurately. For example, I know that just this part of the stalagmite represents 12,000 years of growth. So I can look back very far in time and I can get a very long-lived climate record.
Results show that the climate in the Sierra is influenced by climate changes elsewhere.
What happens climatically up in the high northern latitudes has a direct impact on our climate here. And if those two regions are connected, then they're connected by large-scale atmospheric processes. And that can be related then to climate change.
The data from these stalagmites is tantalizing. It suggests that as Arctic ice sheets melt and disappear, it becomes drier here in California. Perhaps no one knows more about the importance of water to California's native fish than Peter Moyle. He warns that in this century, native salmon and trout could go extinct, and the current drought makes the problem all that more complex.
It complicates it, but it also simplifies it in a sense because it makes it difficult to postpone decision making. If the stream flows are getting lower, you're stressing the fish more.
And this UC Davis biologist says fish don't lie.
I just completed a study of the state of the salmon and trout in California. And I found that 65% of them are in serious decline. And many of them are already listed by state and federal governments as endangered or threatened. And these are the species that require the high-quality cold water.
He has been studying California's native fish population for more than 30 years. And he says saving the fish is a matter of better management.
Improving the way we manage cold water streams that don't have dams on them or small dams by reducing diversions, for example. By better management of the state and federal fish hatcheries that release salmon into the ocean. There's a whole array of things that could be done.
Managing California's water delivery system is as complex as it can get. In the Central Valley, the Delta is like a massive railroad switching yard. Snowmelt from the mountains brings water down rivers to reservoirs that in turn empty into a delta system that provides drinking water to millions of people and water to irrigate farmland. So how does the state move water from north to south? It all begins here near Tracy, where 11 pumps move on average 3 million acre-feet of water a year into a canal that goes hundreds of miles to the south. That's the equivalent of the amount of water needed to fill Folsom Lake 3 times in a year. But most of the land here in the Delta near San Francisco is kept artificially dry by more than 1,000 miles of levees that are beginning to crumble.
The levees in the Delta many of them are not very reliable and increasingly unreliable into the long term, particularly with earthquakes and increasing floods with climate change. So in the long run, we have to think of something different to do with water exports. And we think that in the long term, you really are driven to one of two strategies, either ending exports entirely or having some type of a peripheral canal.
Lund is part of a team of scientists from UC Davis and the nonprofit Public Policy Institute of California that says a peripheral canal is the least expensive, most environmentally positive way to repair the Delta while maintaining water exports.
I think it allows more of the environmental problems to be solved. One of the chief problems we have with the Delta environmentally now is that we're managing the Delta for water supply, whereas if you have a peripheral canal, you can now remanage the Delta for environmental purposes. You've sort of disentangled this set of conflicting purposes.
The best thing for the fish in the San Francisco estuary, in the Delta, is to stop diversions altogether, as well as to reduce upstream diversions. We know that's not likely to happen because of all the economic considerations. Therefore, if we continue to divert water from the Delta, which means taking Sacramento River water, pumping it across the Delta, the best thing for the ecosystem is probably the peripheral canal.
Despite the difficulties facing California, Howard says the state has the ability to adapt to a drier climate.
My studies show that if we can hold on to our share of exports, that despite the cuts in water, despite global climate change, and despite these other cost increases, the profitability and the value of agriculture and the jobs in agriculture can continue to grow, even though the area and the water use cuts back.
Farmers, scientists, and policymakers know that all sides must come together around a plan that can support California through the challenge of global climate change. Paul Fotenauer reporting from Davis.